A philanthropic fund serving Latinx communities in Greater Boston is sharpening its focus on health and economic development. The Latino Equity Fund, previously known as the Latino Legacy Fund, has been trying to close the gap in vaccination rates as well as helping with business recovery. Our guest previously helped with recovery by generating support for relief efforts in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. We'd like to welcome the fund's first executive director, Evelyn Barahona. Thank you very much for being with us, Evelyn.
Thank you so much, Chris, for having me.
Evelyn, I'd like to ask you about this sharpening of focus in the fund, along with the new name, of course. What generated this?
I think I think there was always an aspiration for the fund to have its own dedicated infrastructure, and it was mostly to be able to better serve the Latino community. Even in being within the portfolio of the Boston Foundation, what we found is that in order for us to make the great impact that we needed a very dedicated resource. Prior to this role, I was a donor relations officer at the Boston Foundation, so I served as a liaison. And so I think the idea was that if we were going to be very serious about elevating the issues in the Latino community, we required sort of a deeper commitment and focus.
Well, I know it's been demonstrated that the fund fills a gap as far as raising money and making it available to help the community. But what about the platform gap here? Because we've heard all these stories over the years about how Republicans and even Democrats, cannot really speak effectively for this community, and that the community needs to fill that. Isn't that part of your mission here too?
Absolutely. I mean, it's all of it. I mean, even within our Latino community, I think what people don't realize is that the Latino community is not a monolith. We're an ethnicity that can represent many races. And in fact, when you think of the Latino community in the United States, it's representing about 23 countries that include the Caribbean, South America, Central America, and North America. And so I think for folks to understand sort of like the issues of a community, you have to understand the makeup of it and what sort of makes it tick and the differences even among the community members themselves.
I want to ask you about the inclusion of health disparities is a main issue, because that wasn't so much the case before. What did the pandemic do to change people's thinking here?
I think the pandemic exposed a lot of existing issues that exist in many circles in the Latino community, specifically in the working class and immigrant areas like Chelsea, Lawrence, and other communities that are highly populated by Latinos. And I think when the pandemic hit, we realized very quickly the people that were being mostly impacted were folks that were working in the service hospitality industries, which is actually populated by mostly Latinos. And then in places like Chelsea, when you take into account the density factor of that area, you have something like COVID-19, people living in close quarters and now losing their jobs. So there's a health and economic adverse impact.
Well, the latest figures from the state say Latinos make up about 12% of the state's population, but they account for only 8% of the people who have at least one vaccination shot. What does that mean going ahead?
For us, it means that we have our work cut out for us. We're working with all various stakeholders on the institutional side in philanthropy. We've actually partnered with other funders that have seen a huge need to sort of think creatively about how to get vaccine into arms in communities that make up undocumented, those that have maybe language barriers to English, and then lastly, may not be able to have access to go to a mass vaccination site. So the reason we've sort of invested in mass mobile efforts is to basically sort of provide a cultural competent manner in which to connect with the community while also providing vaccinations and hopefully including them in the healthcare process.
What about the mobile van? How much has that helped?
It's helped tremendously because in addition to the mass mobile vehicles, we've actually have advocated to utilize sort of a strategic communications effort that culturally competent. So instead of making it just about getting vaccinated, we make it about celebrating. So these vaccination sites also include pop-ups where you have music, you have those members of the community interacting with their own community and advocating for them to get vaccines. And I think that's what makes it very different. We made it sort of like social and not something to be scared about, to sort of fight off the disinformation that many communities have been facing with the vaccines.
I know we've mentioned the philanthropic gap as far as money is involved, but I want to ask you about filling that gap because you have some experience with that in the relief efforts after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. What did you learn from the ability of people to even just plug in and help out? What potential do you see from that?
From an MUPR experience.
Yes.
It's important to get very proximate to those that are closest to the pain. What we found is that our biggest partners and supporters were also the community leaders themselves. They're the ones that are able to sort of articulate what are the issues, and we're able to use our platform. And because we're part of a philanthropic community, are able to translate that and elevate it to other institutional funders. And a key thing and takeaway that we learned from the MEPR experience in Puerto Rico is that you cannot just only fundraise and also grant make. You also have to include the members that you're trying to support, because they're sort of like your biggest informational, guides to the solutions. And they're, I think in collaboration with our stakeholders, we're able to sort of accelerate the solution process.
I know you're concerned about economic opportunity and a couple of other gaps out there, broadband access and language learning. What do you hope to accomplish there?
One of the things we're very excited about is that, in sort of thinking about ESOL, thinking of it as a sector. And when you think of ESOL in terms of accessing language, there's a lot of implications to it. So there's the first one that comes to mind is, learning the language so that you could advance in your career. But in reality, it also impacts how you access healthcare. And it also impacts families in terms of how families navigate the education system and are able to speak up on behalf of their children. And then lastly, it sort of highlights the issues that many other coalitions have been bringing up is the broadband equity issue, that not everyone access internet in the same way as maybe you and I do. And I think that that's an equity issue that people didn't think of prior to the pandemic that became a glaring moment, especially when it came to learning the education and then also those that couldn't access telehealth.
I'm thinking of families with kids, people rationing internet access. It was tough to keep up with schoolwork. What's the answer to something like that?
I think it's multifold. I think it starts with making sure that the education, our education partners, meaning the districts, principals and teachers, which, we all have a vested interest in ensuring that our children are getting educated, that they're also getting access. And I think, what you just highlighted in terms of, not being able to, do your homework because maybe perhaps you have a choice between paying for the internet or paying for food. That shouldn't be the question. The question should be, it's like, how do we accelerate the education system in a way that's equitable and then also sort of aligns? Because if there are children that are losing educational opportunities, that actually has a direct outcome to our future economy.
I want to come back to one other idea that this fund, I think, has been trying to address. You're not just looking at health and economic opportunity as separate categories. You're looking at how health affects economic opportunity. What does that mean?
To me, it's very simple. It's without health, there's no wealth. So if people are not having healthy lives, as in they have food insecure, they're housing insecure, then everything else sort of falls by the wayside. You sort of create other additional gaps that you didn't really take into account because you think they're separate. And health has always been sort of integrated into, I believe, economic opportunity. So I think that if you're able to deal with health issues, everything else becomes sort of a trickle down effect.
Well, Evelyn, if people want to keep up and get more information about the fund, is there someplace they can do that online?
Yes, they can. If they go to the Boston Foundation website, we do have a Latino Equity Fund. We fall under the Justice and Equity Fund section of the foundation.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
That was Evelyn Barahona from the Latino Equity Fund. We'll have more news in just a moment.